A musical opened on Broadway 1 year ago this week that, like many Broadway shows these days, was based on a successful movie. School of Rock, the musical, is based on the 2003 movie that starred Jack Black. It tells the story of a misfit music teacher who turns a bunch of misfit students into misfit rock musicians. The stage musical was written by Julian Fellowes, quite a departure from his Downton Abbey, with music by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Now, the musical's still running, which could make this Webber's first hit since Sunset Boulevard in the late 90s. But although they may not even know it, Messrs. Webber, Fellowes, and Black wouldn't have enjoyed the success of their film and stage projects if it weren't for two artists from Canada's West Coast. Now, ironically, as far as I know, the only outlet that has told the full story about the Canadian content is the BBC. I only heard the full story recently from the BBC, and I know one of the two artists. So I think it's high time the story was told by a Canadian. The first of our two heroes is Hans Fenger. 40 years ago, he was a would-be heavy metal musician who was facing the fact that he was never going to be the next Jimmy Page. Needing to actually earn a living, he accepted a job teaching music to elementary school students in Langley, British Columbia. It's just southeast of Vancouver, but in the 70s it was a pretty rural area. Hans didn't really know much about formal teaching methods, but the area was desperately short of teachers, so he got the job. And he decided to teach the kids what he knew, rock and pop songs from the 60s and early 70s. The kids were so enthusiastic about the subject matter that Hans used $48 of his own money to make recordings of their work. As you can hear, the recordings were pretty primitive, even by 70s standards. They were recorded in a school gym using a tape recorder that Hans owned. He took 3 of the 4 strings off the bass so the player's 7-year-old fingers could handle it. They made 2 albums in 2 years that were only distributed to kids and their parents and friends who would fork over a couple of bucks for the privilege. Only 300 copies were pressed. Hans Fenger left Langley soon after, and that would have been the end of it, but 25 years later, the second of our BC heroes entered the story. Brian Linz is an extremely talented actor based in Victoria with whom I shared a dressing room on a couple of shows. He's also a record collector, specializing in the odd and the curious. As such, Brian can never pass by a second-hand record store without dropping in to browse, and that's what he did one day in 2000, where he came across one of the Langley School Music Project recordings that someone had decided they no longer needed in their collection. Brian was intrigued with the recording, and he knew others like him would be too, so he sent a copy of one of the tracks to Erwin Chusid. He hosted a radio show in New York City specializing in what's known as outsider music, creations that are not part of the musical mainstream. Erwin was fascinated by the track and played it on his show. The response was so strong that Erwin called Brian Linz and asked if there was any more. So Brian sent him a copy of the album. Then Erwin tracked down Hans Fenger, who told him there was also a second album. The albums became very popular at the station in New York, and Erwin thought a wider audience should be able to own the Langley recordings. So a year later, a compilation CD was released. Much of the material was not what you normally hear a 7-year-old singing.
Desperado, why don't you come to your senses? You've been out running fences so long now.
As Hans Fenger said later, many of the kids on the recording were going through some pretty rough times, a combination of growing up and in some cases problems at home. That's what gave the material its plaintive quality. The Eagles' Desperado was a perfect example of the album's combination of innocence and despair. In fact, that's what the compilation was called. And when it was released, 6 weeks after the devastating attacks of 9/11, the music struck a chord, even if that chord was sometimes out of key. Response was enthusiastic both at home and abroad. Innocence and Despair was distributed internationally. In Britain, on the day of its release, it outsold Mick Jagger's solo album. David Bowie, whose Space Oddity is on the CD, called it a piece of art that I couldn't have conceived of. Besides music by David Bowie and lots of Beach Boys material, there were songs made famous by Paul McCartney, the Bay City Rollers, Neil Diamond, and Barry Manilow. And there was even some Canadian content, a tune originally written and recorded by Klaatu but made famous by the Carpenters.
In your mind, you have capacities, you know, to telepath messages through the vast unknown. Please close.
Now, as I say, I shared a dressing room with Brian Lenz, once in a Belfry Theatre production of Urinetown the Musical, once again in Bluebridge Theatre's inaugural production of As You Like It. And Brian never told me about any of this. He's just that kind of guy. I was even doing an art show on a Victoria radio station at the time and would have told the world, or at least Victoria, about it. Brian, man, I would have made you beloved in Victoria. Oh wait, you already are. Now back to our story. A documentary was made of the Langley School's music project. One of the people who saw it was Mike White, a screenwriter and associate of Jack Black. Mike knew that Jack wanted to show off his rock and roll chops, so he wrote what became School of Rock. It became one of the highest-grossing movie musical comedies in history. The stage version is into its second year. It grossed about $1.5 million last week alone. Neither Hans Fenger nor Brian Lenz receive any royalties. I don't think Hans even got his $48 back. And they don't even get any credit. Although, Brian, I'm doing my best. With this week's Musical Almanac, I'm Scott Walker.